No one else in US history dominated politics like Franklin D. Roosevelt. Not only was he the only US president to win 4 consecutive terms, but in his first re-election in 1936, he was so immensely popular that he carried every state in the nation but 2. In South Carolina, he won with a dumbfounding 98% of the vote. To put that percentage into perspective, FDR's margin of victory there was larger than former dictator Bashar al-Assad's claimed 95% in the blatantly rigged Syrian presidential elections of 2021. While many people correctly associate him with the New Deal, which was one of the most progressive government programs in the country's history, Franklin D. Roosevelt was not a radical, nor was he a leftist, despite the effort of his opponent in the 1932 election to label him as such. Although Republican incumbent President Herbert Hoover accused FDR of being a socialist and how that the Democrat would lead the nation on a march to Moscow, Roosevelt was an aristocrat born into a wealthy family and a capitalist through and through. Contrary to Hoover's characterization of FDR as a danger to capitalism, historian Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. has argued that in fact, the purpose of FDR's presidency was to humanize, redeem, and rescue capitalism. At the time in the 1930s, when the specter of communism loomed over Europe, Roosevelt worked to ensure that the capitalist system in the US survived. He did this through a series of reforms that made it more bearable for the working class. And unlike many leftists at the time, Roosevelt during his presidency did not promote the egalitarian values of racial equality. Infamously, of course, he was responsible for the executive order that led to the internment of over 100,000 Japanese Americans during World War II. Roosevelt was also weak on civil rights. When Northern Democrats proposed an anti-lynching legislation in Congress, Roosevelt was hesitant to support such a measure, worrying that he might alienate segregationist Southern Democrats. "If I come out for the anti-lynching bill now," he said, "Southern Democrats will block every bill I ask Congress to pass to keep America from collapsing. I just can't take that risk." Yet, despite failing to promote some of the most important left-wing principles of anti-capitalism and anti-racism, Franklin D. Roosevelt managed to win the support of various leftist radicals in the US, and they were, in fact, vital to his electoral success. Not all socialists and communists supported FDR, but many of them did, and they became some of his most crucial campaigners, helping him secure 4 consecutive terms as president. So why did so many radicals support FDR in the 1930s and 1940s? Why would anti-capitalists get behind a candidate whose purpose was to save capitalism? Why did working class leftists back an aristocrat like Roosevelt? In this episode, I want to examine these questions to see, perhaps, they offer clues to the course today's Democratic Party may need to pursue. To help me on this endeavor, I enlisted the help of the foremost expert on the history of leftist politics and the Democratic Party in the United States, Georgetown University historian and editor of Dissent magazine, Michael Kazin. Dr. Kazin has published numerous books, including The Populist Persuasion, a book about the history of populism in the United States, American Dreamers, How the Left Changed the Nation, and his most recent book, a fantastic work I highly recommend to all my viewers, What It Took to Win, A History of the Democratic Party. In his writings, Dr. Kazin emphasizes the pivotal role of organized labor in Roosevelt's electoral success. He specifically highlights the importance of the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which was formed after splitting from the more moderate American Federation of Labor, or AFL Union. As Dr. Kazin explains in The Populist Persuasion, the CIO was the only national organization that offered Roosevelt tens of thousands of campaigners, millions of loyal votes, and support for his efforts to purge the party of Dixiecrats and isolationists who had soured on most of his policies. Dr. Kazin further emphasizes the role of labor in What It Took to Win, when he writes that after FDR's first re-election in 1936, the Democrats would become, for a time, the closest thing the United States would ever have to a party dependent on the support of organized labor. What's more, as Dr. Kazin explains, the union most crucial to Roosevelt's success, the CIO, had many radicals in its ranks, organizing strikes as well as campaigning in elections.
But it's fair to say also, some people don't realize the CIO does grow very quickly during the 1930s. There are big strikes. You had an auto worker strike I mentioned before. There's a big strike of textile workers in 1934 as well. There's a strike of electrical workers and a big strike of longshore workers on the West Coast, which actually a general strike in 1934 in San Francisco, which leads to the formation of the Longshore Workers Union there. they believed obviously in elections, in running candidates for office and supporting candidates for office. Uh, they also believed uh, in very innovative tactics like a sit-down strike, where sit-down strike, you basically workers, instead of leaving their place of business, their factory, their department store, they stay there, they sleep there, they live there in their workplace until the strike is settled.
While many of the key leaders of the CIO union were not socialists or revolutionaries themselves, Dr. Kazin points out that activists from the Communist Party and other radical groups were among the CIO's most dedicated and skillful organizers. So I asked Dr. Kazin, why would communists within the ranks of the CIO union explicitly support FDR? Why would avowed anti-capitalists get behind a candidate whose purpose was to save capitalism? Why did working class leftists back an aristocrat like Roosevelt?
The short answer is fascism.
Hmm.
That is, 1935, the Communist International, the Comintern, holds a conference, and they change their line. The line before that, from the late 1920s to 1935, was push for revolution, don't put any trust in capitalist parties. And in fact, 1934, the Communist Party calls Roosevelt a fascist because he is, trying to take control of the economy in the interest of, keeping capitalism, surviving. But after Hitler takes power in Germany, and to some degree militarists taking power in Japan, and Mussolini was already in power in Italy by the mid-30s, communists are being persecuted, killed, put in concentration camps in Germany, also socialists for that matter. And so communists around the world believe very firmly that they have to put aside their hopes for revolution, at least in the short run. It's more important to build what was called sometimes a united front, sometimes a popular front of all anti-fascist forces. They did that in Spain during the Spanish Civil War in the late 1930s. They did that in France during the Popular Front in the late 1930s, and some other European countries as well. Similar kinds of formations, and that was true in the United States too. The Communist Party was not that large, I should say. At its height, it had about 100,000 members, but some of its people were well placed, as you mentioned. Communists were heads of the United Electrical Workers Union, the International Longshoremen's Union on the West Coast, some smaller unions as well. They were active organizers in the United Auto Workers and the United Steel Workers, even though they were not the heads of those unions. But they felt that it was much more important in 1936 to support Roosevelt and the New Deal as a coalition of democratic, small d democratic forces against the possibility of fascism in the United States and the possibility of a Republican president who might be more supportive or at least less antagonistic towards fascists and right-wing militarists overseas. So that's the main reason.
Unlike many contemporary self-declared communists, the communists within the CIO were not accelerationists who believed that things needed to get worse in order for revolution to take place. Nor were there purists who thought they would betray their values if they made temporary alliances with pro-capitalists like the Democratic Party. Instead, as Dr. Kazin explains, they put aside their ultimate aim of a socialist revolution and chose to focus on anti-fascist organizing. They understood that defeating fascism was a greater priority than trying to achieve the dream of a socialist revolution, and they knew how to appeal to American workers who were otherwise less inclined to the more radical ideas.
I should also say that, radical or not, if you're a good organizer, you don't want to get too far ahead of the people you're organizing. And the CIO was organized mostly by non-radicals. It was organized by unionists who certainly wanted working class people to have more power, have recognition, but they were doing it within the capitalist system. But most workers who were organized, whether they were steel workers or auto workers or tobacco workers or longshore workers in the CIO, wanted a union. They wanted higher wages. They wanted more time off. They wanted job security. They wanted somewhat more power on the job, less authoritarian treatment by their foremen and by their bosses. But they weren't going on strike for socialism. They weren't going on strike to support the Soviet Union. They were going on strike because they wanted to improve their lives within the system, only system they knew, which was the capitalist system. So, even though communist organizers were very important in the CIO, they were the firebrands, the spearheads of the famous Flint sit-down strike in Flint, Michigan, that really established the United Auto Workers as a major union in America. Got recognition from General Motors because of that sit-down strike. Those communists did not talk about being communist. They just talked about trying to organize a union. And they didn't take credit as communists for helping to organize that union. So that's going on as well.
The concession to practical imperatives did not mean that the radicals within the CIO union had completely abandoned their socialist aspirations. On the contrary, one of the key leaders of the CIO union was a labor organizer who was most likely a socialist his entire life, a man named Sidney Hillman. Hillman was a Jew from Russia who, in his youth, organized during the early phases of the Russian Revolution with a faction of socialists called the Mensheviks, which were first allied and then split with Vladimir Lenin's Bolsheviks. Hillman later fled Russia due to the Tsarist-backed anti-Jewish pogroms that had spread across his native country at the time. Years later, after arriving in New York City as an immigrant, he became leader of a clothing workers union and then a co-founder of the CIO union.
Sidney Hillman was an immigrant from the Russian Empire. He had been, as you say, a Russian revolutionary as a young man. But he went on to form one of the most important unions in America, which is independent until the CIO, called the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, which people who made men's clothing. And he was a socialist. I think remained a socialist at heart until the end of his life, actually. But he was a democratic socialist. We might call him a social democrat. It's a European term. But his politics is not that different from, say, Bernie Sanders or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. But again, he was very practical. He saw that Franklin Roosevelt and at least Northern Democrats in the New Deal were supportive of unions organizing. And he realized this was essential, of course, to get support from the federal government for that organizing. He was a big supporter of course, the National Labor Relations Act, which was enacted in 1935. And so he goes on to be sort of unofficial, you might say, labor czar or something, to use
might not like
an ironic term for a Russian revolutionary.
In 1943, after Republicans and conservative Southern Democrats in Congress overrode FDR's veto to pass the Smith-Connolly Act, which prohibited unions from directly contributing to candidates in federal elections, Sidney Hillman came up with an innovative approach, one whose repercussions are still felt today. Hillman took advantage of the loophole in the new law to create the very first political action committee in U.S. history, called the CIO PAC. In this way, the union was able to thwart the attempt to hamstring their political power, allowing it to continue to support and raise money for FDR in the 1944 presidential election.
He does, in 1944, form the first PAC within the CIO, called the CIO PAC, which was unusual because this was a labor union federation which was raising money to support a Democratic candidate. Unions had supported Democratic candidates before, going back to Samuel Gomper's day in the early 20th century, but they hadn't put together a political action committee which has raised money from lots of other people. They raised money from Hollywood stars. They raised money from academics. So it was a cross-class PAC in that sense, just like PACs are today for the most part. And they also put a lot of literature, a lot of publicity, including cartoons, which you can see online, to give money to. And they had their own program, which was more social democratic, more radical, if you will, than the New Deal program itself. They wanted guaranteed national income. They wanted, housing for everybody. They wanted, of course, everyone to be able to form a union. Their program was close to that of the British Labour Party that took power in Britain in 1945. They really wanted a much larger welfare state, the kind of thing that was not going to pass Congress anytime soon. But they saw, again, Roosevelt as by far the lesser evil to the Republican in that year. And it was an important precedent, I think, which, of course, has been followed in many ways ever since.
Today, when many left-wing progressives criticize the big money influence of PACs and super PACs in elections, it is something of a surprise to discover that this widely derided institution of contemporary politics was the brainchild of a former Russian revolutionary. It is a great irony that the concept of the PAC first originated with a socialist. The CIO pact was crucial in ensuring FDR's fourth consecutive term in 1944. The president would even write to Hillman a few weeks after the election. One thing I want to make perfectly clear to you, Sidney, is my appreciation. It was a great campaign, and nobody knows better than I do how much you contributed to its success. The CIO and the CIO pact were not only ahead of FDR in their vision of a welfare state, they were also much more advanced than the president on issues of civil rights and racial equality. The CIO welcomed black workers to its ranks, recognizing them as workers fighting for a similar class struggle as white workers. When the president of the CIO, John L. Lewis, addressed the NAACP convention in 1940, he declared, "The problem of the Negro people are the problems of all American wage earners." The publicity director of the union during the New Deal era, Linda Cox, also wrote that there is no room for baiting of any minority group or nationality or race in the CIO. We are against all forms of red baiting, of Jew baiting, of Catholic baiting, of alienating. The communists within the CIO who organized a pivotal sit-down strike in Flint, Michigan, also protested with the slogan, "Black and white, unite and fight." Even though FDR had, to say the least, a lackluster record on racial equality, support from the CIO proved successful in convincing black American voters to switch their allegiance from Republican to Democrat. In Roosevelt's stunning landslide in 1936, African Americans in the South were still prevented from voting due to Jim Crow laws, but in northern states where African Americans could vote, Roosevelt became the first Democratic presidential nominee to win the black vote away from the party of Lincoln. In the late 1930s, a poll found that 90% of black respondents approved of FDR's economic objectives. In the 1936 election, African American neighborhoods in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, which had never voted for a Democratic presidential nominee before, would vote for Roosevelt by 70%. Recognizing that they were now crucial to their electoral chances, the CIO's success in convincing black Americans to vote Democrats would help lay the foundation for the party to support civil rights decades later.
So I do think it was critical. Now, that the CIO was so important to the Democratic Party, and that the Democratic Party was beginning to move away from its long racist history. I think that is true. At the same time, liberals, professionals, others, even party bosses, understood that since the Great Migration of black people during World War I and afterwards to northern cities from the South, the black vote was more important too to the Democratic Party. And Democrats and black people, for the first time in history, when they have the vote, begin to vote for Democrats in the 1930s, and that mattered too, of course. So if you want to keep the black vote, you're not going to be able to say, "Oh, we're all for segregation, we're all for Jim Crow, we have no problem with lynchings." You're going to have to find ways to muddle your message at best about that. So, look, Democratic Party was a broad coalition, and as you said before, it had some of the worst racists in American history in it, and it had communists and black communists in it as well. So, a much broader coalition than either party has today.
Thanks to leftists and radical labor organizers, Franklin D. Roosevelt succeeded in winning 4 consecutive presidential elections. These people also helped usher in a golden age for successive Democratic administrations to enact progressive measures, from food stamps to Medicaid, as well as civil rights legislations. But the Democratic Party today has forgotten its own history and how leftist organizers were vital in making them the party of the New Deal and civil rights. As the modern Republican Party has turned into a reactionary and quasi-fascist party on the verge of overturning decades of progress on racial and economic equality, the Democratic Party is on the ropes, attesting to the breach of the modern Democratic Party with its progressive past. Dr. Kazin argues that it is the Democrats who are now the conservative party, as they cling to government institutions and laws in place now without offering any new solutions to make further progress and change. Writing in The Nation magazine earlier this spring, Dr. Kazin states, "Liberals and many leftists have become the new conservatives. Against the radical, if utterly reactionary experiment being run from the White House and cheered on by MAGA faithfuls, everyone from Democratic leaders in Congress to the hosts of MSNBC, and even some writers for magazines like this one, resort to an anxious defense of prominent institutions. Essential it is to defend institutions that millions of Americans need. That alone would not address why so many working class people, particularly but not only white ones, have soured on both partisan Democrats and some causes left activists fought to win or gains they seek to preserve. In our interview, Dr. Kazin returned to this point.
I think for the Democrats to build a majority coalition again, they have to do some things which are obvious. One, of course, is win back some of the working class voters they've lost, especially white, but they've been losing more Black and Hispanic working class voters as well, especially in 2024. And also, they're going to have to be seen as a party which cares about the future, not just protecting the gains of the past, which I wrote an article for The Nation magazine back in March about this. Many people see the Democrats as more conservative in the literal sense than the Republicans. Every day, Donald Trump makes news by doing something new here, nothing new there. A lot of stuff is terrible, even a little loony, changes his mind. But Democrats are seen as we're just hunching down, trying to keep what we have, keep all the good things. That's not enough. Americans are unhappy for a reason, a lot of them.
For Democrats to win again, like they did during the New Deal era, they can't just be a conservative party promising to defend existing American institutions against Donald Trump's authoritarian assault. They need to introduce bold, progressive solutions to change society that have been spearheaded by the left. Medicare for all, a Green New Deal, a federal jobs guarantee, just to name a few. But to their own detriment, the Democratic leadership has done all they could not to let anyone on the left to set the party's agenda. They instead have tried to ostracize the very people that they need to regain the support of working class Americans. As I am recording this in October 2025, Democratic House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries and Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer still refuse to endorse the popular socialist New York City mayoral candidate and the Democratic nominee Zohran Mamdani. Last December in 2024, congressional Democrats refused to vote for their party's rising star Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez for the position of ranking member of the House Oversight Committee. Instead, they gave it to a now deceased 75-year-old Representative Gary Connolly. During the last presidential election in 2024, the Democrats also made all their top talking points about Trump's Project 2025 and Democratic backsliding. Even the most modest proposals from the left or center left, like a public option for a broken healthcare system or lowering the cost of college tuition, seemed anathema to them. The fact of the matter is that centrist liberals in the Democratic Party need leftists more than leftists need the centrists. After all, it was the left that helped FDR and the subsequent New Deal Democrats from 1930s to 1960s. It was left-wing activists who campaigned vigorously for liberal Democrats to help win election after election. It is to their own political peril that the current Democratic Party leadership continues to snub this faction of their party. In doing so, and ignoring what made the New Deal so successful, the Democratic Party leadership runs the risk of forcing progressives and radicals to form their own third party. Frustration could split the liberals and leftists from forming an anti-fascist Popular Front coalition, and in turn, allow Trump's authoritarianism to prevail.